Welcome to RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week we talk politics, asking a British historian and a Russian refusenik to help us gain some perspective on what the heck just happened. In the second half of our show, we'll be joined by Alex Markovsky, author of Liberal Bolshevism, America Did Not Defeat Communism, She Adopted It. Up first, we're pleased to welcome award-winning historian, author of Napoleon, A Life, and visiting professor at King's College London, Andrew Roberts. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be on your show, Bill.
Andrew, our show stayed out of the fray during the presidential election, but we're cautiously wading back in for some post-election analysis. I asked you on to give us a British historian's view of what just happened, why, and what might happen next. You were very critical of the primary system process that served up the two most loathed presidential candidates in American history. How did the party primaries get so broken?
I think they've been broken for a long time, in fact. It's just that one hasn't had a situation where some 60% of the American people have despised both candidates. It's, in a sense, ever since the 1890s, you've had this primary system, which is the modern way of doing politics in America. And very often it has actually thrown up somebody who's unpopular, but to get both parties doing that at the same time is unique.
Is it because we're beginning to allow open primaries where people can cross parties and cause mischief?
I think open primaries are a major problem, yes. Of course, somebody is not going to support the candidate they really want to be president if they're from a different party. It's an outrageous system to allow people to vote in the primaries of parties that aren't their own.
Should there be a time period by which you must have been a member in a party before they allow you to vote in their primary?
I think that there should be a time period for candidates. I think it's extraordinary that people can self-identify as a Democrat or a Republican and therefore be allowed by the party to stand with that label. I'm not sure necessarily that that extends to voters. But I also think that you've got a major problem with constantly allowing Iowa and New Hampshire to kick off. Why on earth should it be those two states automatically that dominate the early part of this process? And there are many other very sort of strange things that are not part of your Constitution at all.
Yeah, well, none of this is, right? The Constitution doesn't even imagine parties, and Washington hated the very idea. Of course, that didn't last long.
No, that's right. And also, I mean, it doesn't mention caucuses or primaries at all. The Constitution is a rather wonderful document, largely because of that.
What specific recommendations would you make to Democratic and Republican Party leaders to make sure that their primaries bring forward their best candidates rather than their worst?
Well, I think you've really got to look at these debates. The idea that you can have up to 20 debates in which a dozen people, sometimes more, stand up there and are given something as tiny as 30 seconds in order to try to encapsulate really quite complicated and intellectually rather taxing positions is completely ludicrous. And of course you're going to get somebody who is grandstanding rather than thinking.
Well, isn't the attention span of the American voter these days about 30 seconds or 140 characters?
I absolutely don't believe that. I think the American elector is an awful lot smarter, an awful lot more reflective than the politicians allow them to think they are.
That's not a very commonly held view. How do you back that up?
I back that up because it's an assumption on behalf of politicians, not just in America, but all over the world, that you have to go for effectively the intellectually lowest common denominator, that is the way in which to appeal to electorates. But I don't think that's fair. I don't think when one looks perhaps at the rest of the culture, that you can assume that great moments like elections should be won or lost on the basis of the intellectually lowest common denominator.
Parliamentary systems seem to do a better job allowing for the emergence of third parties. Will the U.S. first past the post electoral system always remain a two-party duopoly?
Yes, I think the way in which, of course, it's in a sense just a factor of the fact that your country is 5 times bigger than mine, and therefore first past the post, and we also have first past the post, but we have a lot more regional variation in the way we vote. In America, it's so much easier to break it down to the two-party system, which is as powerful as the one-party system is in Zimbabwe or somewhere like that.
Yeah. There seems to be a lot of people very frustrated with that, but they don't know what to do with it because they're told they'll waste their vote if they vote for a third party.
And they're right. And really, it is completely impossible to see another party come together because the two parties in America are so much coalitions of many, many different types of people who may be voting for almost diametrically opposite things, but nevertheless have to coalesce in order to try and stop the other.
Andrew, you've written that there's a competition in the world between state corporatism and democracy. Explain. When
one looks at the Far East, especially, of course, at China, but also at Vietnam and various other post-communist economies that are able to produce 6, 7, sometimes 8% GDP growth, and then you look at the United States, which simply can't and hasn't for a very, very long time, let alone most of Europe, which is mired in 1% growth, one sees an argument, an ideological argument, which is very, very dangerous for democracy. And that argument goes that, yes, we might not have freedom, but we've got GDP growth. And China is, in the next 5 years or so, going to outstrip the United States in terms of absolute GDP, and that's a very, very worrying position to be in.
Well, you talk about the threat to democracy, but the U.S. wasn't founded as a democracy. We were founded as a constitutionally limited republic of strictly enumerated powers. When we started out with indirect election of senators and the president, and most governing powers were left to the states. Is there any hope of the U.S. returning to its constitutional roots, or is that just a hopeless libertarian dream?
No, I don't think it's a hopeless libertarian dream at all. I think that you're very fortunate to have a founding document which is so enlightened and so intelligent and so libertarian and also so specific. But none of those things that you mentioned are actually dyed-in-the-wool anti-democratic, except perhaps the electoral college concept. By and large, America and democracy have managed to coalesce very well. The sort of Venn diagram, if you have America on one side, democracy on the other, the Venn diagram is very heavily shaded where the two overlap. You're right that they're not identical. But compared to somewhere like China, which has no First Amendment, which has no constitutional rights or Bill of Rights, which is a totalitarian, to all intents and purposes, dictatorship, you really have got something in America that is so precious and so sublime that it must be fought for.
The UK is going through its Brexit upheaval. We've just had a renegade outsider elected president here in the US, and Eurosceptic parties are gaining momentum in France, Italy, and Germany. Are we going through some kind of meltdown of the global world order?
They're very, very different. Brexit was about, I was very much in favor of Brexit. Brexit was about open markets. It was about getting back our sovereignty, having our judges decide the validity of laws rather than those that sit in Europe. You already have that. Your Supreme Court actually gives you that already. The question is whether or not you're still going to be open to free trade and open markets. In France, I think that their constitution and the way in which they have their last presidential election of the 2 presidential elections means that Mrs. Le Pen cannot win, thank God, in France, because the same thing will happen as happened in 2002, where the socialists will coalesce around the right-wing candidate in order to stop the neo-fascists.
Andrew, let's come back to Brexit, the impending collapse of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, and a growing fear that the world might be heading for trade war. Could we see a return of the Smoot-Hawley disaster that helped trigger the Great Depression?
I really think we could see that. The way in which Mr. Trump has been speaking makes me fear that the incredibly tight balancing act between getting the best deal for America and actually seeing China in particular, but other countries also possibly, trying to engage in a sort of race for the bottom, might mean that the thing that has made America so rich over the years, which have been free trading and free markets, might actually come to an end over the next 4 to 8 years.
You know, with the UK leaving the euro and people talking about reshuffling the deck, there's been some talk of a free trade union amongst the English-speaking peoples. You call the CANZUKs. What is that, and what are the chances of its success?
The CANZUKs is a acronym for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, i.e. the English-speaking peoples minus the United States. Although, of course, ultimately it would be wonderful if we had a free trading agreement and free movement of peoples even with the United States as well. But if you had those 4 countries come together, it would be the largest country in the world in terms of sheer land mass. It would be extraordinarily minerally strong. It would be the 3rd in terms of GDP per capita. It would be the 3rd strongest nation in the world in terms of defense. We already have the rule of law that is pretty much the same from the British system. We have all 4 of those countries have the same head of state in Her Majesty the Queen. We've got the same language. We've got things that bind us that are far more than any normal union of states. So if we could organize a federalized system in which we came together as effectively a single country, we would be a great ally of the United States and a very powerful nation. So it's something that I've just joined the advisory board of the CANZUK Union to see whether or not this could happen in our lifetimes.
And if the U.S. joins, is this not a revival of the British Empire?
No, the U.S. would never actually join another country. Clearly, your 1776 is alive and well, and 240 years later. But you could definitely have a defense agreement with that group. You could have as I say, a free trading area, a free movement of peoples. I mean, we have so much in common with you, not the head of state, but pretty much every single other thing that I mentioned with regard to language and law.
You've mentioned China and Asia, Europe, and the English-speaking peoples. Where does Putin's Russia fit in today's arc of history?
Well, Putin has got a major problem, several obvious major problems, not least the demographic one, and the fact that his country is 7th or 8th economically. It's about half the economy of the United Kingdom. And he's got a rapidly aging and dying population, very appalling numbers with regard to its demographics, especially the number of young people who die in Russia. So he's got to either act to deal with these problems, which he doesn't seem to be wanting to do at all, or he might be forced into some kind of a ghastly Bonapartist-style foreign policy adventurism, which we are seeing, of course, in Syria and in the eastern Ukraine.
What do you make of progressive charges that Russian propaganda fueled a fake news movement and then hacked American voting machines to defeat Hillary?
I think that's rubbish. They didn't hack the voting machines, but they definitely did hack Hillary, which I think is very funny to see the way in which the left, which has criticized the NSA and made it out to be some kind of a almost fascist organization, the minute that the NSA actually says something that they agree with, i.e. that Russia undermined Hillary by its use of hacking and the DNC, suddenly the NSA becomes a sort of beacon of truth and decency. That's wonderfully hypocritical of the left. You hear that kind of thing all the time. But they did do this. They did help make Trump president in their own way. The leaks to WikiLeaks, which did damage Hillary over the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks or so of the election, were obviously an embarrassment. And it's a bad thing when any foreign country gets a chance to intervene domestically in the United States.
Andrew, Donald Trump's signature election policy was immigration restriction, a drum the Eurosceptics are banging rather loudly. Is Western civilization undergoing a demographic invasion?
I think Western civilization is indeed undergoing a demographic invasion. But it's not the same in the United States as it is in the European Union. In the United States, you have large numbers of people coming in who are Christian. They are ready to assimilate to different degrees, but nonetheless they are. And most of them are willing to work very hard. With the problems that we have in Eastern Europe and Germany at the moment, the infusion of several million people who are not Christian, who sometimes are actually antithetical to the societies that they are entering, and who are culturally completely different from the host nation, means that we are going to have problems that are much more serious than the ones that you're going to have.
Regardless of who wins elections, a permanent bureaucracy has day-to-day control of enormous powers in both the U.S. and the U.K. Forget about Europe, which sunk under the waves a long time ago. Do you see any hope of reform that would make these armies of civil servants less powerful and more accountable?
All it takes is for politicians to be gutsier. There have been times when the civil service has been almost out of control, and if you have a strong politician, classic example being Ronald Reagan and another Margaret Thatcher, they can get on top of this. They can cut it back. They have the final say. They are able to control the civil servants. But you do need an extraordinary level of willpower, which you do get occasionally in strong-minded leaders in the West, but only very occasionally. But it can be done.
Does Donald Trump have a shot at draining the swamp?
Well, you see, his problem with regard to draining the swamp is that you can't have people who are completely inexperienced at government at every level of government. Of course, they're going to be inexperienced at the top. Mr. Trump hasn't held any elected office. But at some stage further on down the food chain, the Washington administrative and political food chain, you've got to have people who know what they're doing. So, yes, you need expertise, but also you need efficiency. And if you entirely use people who you think are swamp life, then how on earth are you going to be able to square that circle?
Well, it's going to be interesting to watch the drama unfold. Will Western democracies, in particular the U.S. and the U.K., always remain a house divided between progressives seeking to expand the power of government and conservatives looking to rein it in? And does this portend permanent political war?
Yes, and that's not a bad thing. Permanent political war is the meat and drink for democracy. One should have permanent political war and cultural war as well. It's not a bad thing. It's part of a proper pluralistic state. And as you say, liberals and socialists and communists will always attempt to increase the size and power of the state, and conservatives should be completely driven in the exact opposite way, and that's a healthy thing.
I find it strange when I talk to my liberal friends who have worked very hard to increase the powers of the executive branch, that when it falls into the hands of their enemy, rather than stepping back and saying, maybe that was a mistake, they just fight harder to regain control.
Well, liberals will never accept that they've made a mistake. It's a more attractive feature of the conservative movement that they're more willing to accept an element of having made mistakes. I don't know whether or not it's just that we don't have quite the same psychological disorders, or we are better brought up. I'm not sure where the difference comes from. But the fact is that it's next to impossible ever to get a liberal to admit he or she has made a mistake.
You know, speaking of learning from mistakes, what responsibility do historians have to make sure the younger generation has a clue how we got into the messes we found ourselves in?
I think historians are absolutely central to this, actually. It was Shelley who said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. And I disagree. I think it's the historians who are. One only needs to look at the past, as Churchill said, read history. And that way you can see where the problems lie, where they came from, how to deal with them to a lesser extent as well. I think without history, we are like people who have no memory, and it would be weird to go through life without a memory.
How do we squeeze history into 140-character tweets?
I don't think that that the world is going to be driven forever by 140-character tweets. I think that we are a nation, both Britain and America, a nation that reads books, that enjoys cultured and intelligent discussion and debate, that you only have to go to people's dinner tables or in the saloons and pubs to know that people like talking, like arguing, like discussing. And that's why, ultimately, our society, democratic society, is going to win out, because the best ideas are going to come forward and they're going to defeat the bad ideas, which are the ones that you can see dominating totalitarian states. It's a good thing, ultimately, and we shouldn't be too worried about the future, I think.
So, Andrew, what gives you hope that the Western democracies won't collapse from the inside like all democracies have throughout history? I
think that democracies haven't collapsed throughout history from the inside. I think many have just been crushed. They've been invaded. They've been partitioned. They've been treated abominably. But actually, the way in which one sees ordinary people wanting to control their own lives, to be in countries, naturally feeling part of nation states, the way in which they behave well towards their neighbours, the way in which they assume that the duty of an adult is to work hard in order to take care of their children. All of these incredibly positive parts of the human condition argue in favour of the future and the success and the vibrancy of modern democracies.
Andrew, it's been an absolute delight. You have motivated to go tackle your Napoleon book, and I look forward to the upcoming Churchill book. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Bill.
That was historian Andrew Roberts, author of Napoleon, A Life, and visiting professor at King's College London, here on RealClear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. RealClear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with RealClear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by RealClearRadio.org and sign up for updates. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit DonorsTrust.org. Ahead, we'll speak with Soviet refusenik Alex Markovsky, author of Liberal Bolshevism, America Did Not Defeat Communism, She Adopted It. Stay tuned.